Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Special Projects Manager, and I'd like to welcome you to today's special Zoominar, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and ensuring women's rights, with historian Pamela Nadell and journalist Elaine Weiss. Please note that today's session is being recorded, and the link will be available later this week. We will take some of your questions at the end of the program, so please type them in the Q&A box. Following today's program, be sure to visit our website to read more articles about women's issues. You can view all of our past programs and sign up for next week's Zoominar, The March Continues, the message of civil rights pioneers Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Now for today's program. Professor Pamela Nadell holds the Patrick Clenadin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program and is a past president of the Association for Jewish Studies. She has consulted with the National Museum of American Jewish History and the Library of Congress. Her most recent book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the National Jewish Book Award's Everett Family Foundation Jewish Book of the Year. Elaine Weiss is an award-winning journalist and writer, and her byline has appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, and the New York Times, as well as reports and documentaries for National Public Radio and Voice of America. Her most recent book, The Women's Hour, The Fight to Win the Vote, won the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award and is being developed for TV with Hillary Rodham Clinton serving as executive producer. Please welcome Pamela Nadell and Elaine Weiss.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Suzanne. First of all, it's so great to be here, and it's a thrill to be with you, Elaine, in conversation. And I loved your book. I was so blown away. It says on the cover it's a page turner. It is, because the story of what happened, and I think most people have no idea of how close this nation came in 1920 to not ratify the 19th Amendment. So I was really curious, how did you come to write this?
Oh, well, thanks, Pam. It's great to be with you, and especially this moment. We just celebrated Ratification Day yesterday, and looking forward to next week when the 19th Amendment enters the Constitution, or at least the anniversary of that. I came to write about this. I'm a journalist turned writer of narrative history, because I really recognized in a kind of funny moment that I'm very interested in politics, and I get involved in campaigns, and I'm very aware of political and electoral issues. And yet I really could not have told you when American women got the vote, how they got the vote, why they got the vote. I knew at one point the Constitution did not provide it, and then at another it did. And I asked my friends, very well-educated women and men, and I said, do you know how American women won the vote? And they give me this blank stare and mumble something like, oh, Seneca Falls. And I thought, oh boy, there's a real empty spot here in our knowledge. And what I've come to realize is that's very true, that we have not been taught it. And you would know this even better at the university level, certainly at the grade school level. It's rarely taught. If it is, it's often, again, not perhaps in a women's studies curriculum, but it's often dismissed as, in 1848, American women demanded the vote at the Seneca Falls Convention, and then in 1920, they were given the vote, and that's it. And I wanted to look at what that span of 72 years was, and it was a shocking story to me. And I realized that in telling the story of the last moment, the last state to have to ratify, which is Tennessee, that I could tell the whole story. I could move the camera back and explain how women had gotten to this point, how the movement had gotten to this point, and how America was still torn. It was really divided about whether women should have the right to vote. Something we kind of take as a given, but it was not a given. And I think as our discussion progresses, we will be able to talk about how there are many issues that are still on the table, that were being discussed a century ago. Now, you also have devoted a great deal of your professional energy to explaining American Jewish women's place in this country's history. And I know you have great knowledge of the Jewish women as suffragists. So what led you to devote this kind of energy and intellectual firepower to this topic?
I think I've been interested in stories of women and women's history since I was a little girl. I actually remember going to libraries as a kid, and I would read all the biographies of women,
Those blue, remember the blue ones?
Right, exactly. Yeah. Betsy Ross and
Helen Keller.
Clara Barton. And didn't you think, like, when I was thinking about this, I went to see, was there a series of just female biographies? No. But those were the only ones I pulled off the shelf. I wasn't interested in reading, Thomas Jefferson or George Washington. So I've been interested in this for a long time. And I want to get into this in the conversation, because then I became really fascinated for lots of reasons. I mean, I've written on different topics in American Jewish history for a long time now. And then I decided I wanted to try and put it together. Also a little bit like what you did, like a big story in a fairly compact shape. Like not, I mean, my original manuscript, I don't know if this happened to you, my original manuscript was twice as long.
Mine was cut by about 25 to 30%.
So the bane of the existence. So maybe let's go back to Seneca Falls for a minute, because you started there. When you talk about Seneca Falls in the book, what do you talk about? How do you see that as such a major starting point?
Well, it's interesting because, as you know, historians really believe that it's not a starting point. It is important because it's the first organized meeting for women's rights. But women have been talking about it, of course, forever. We have Abigail Adams' famous plea to her husband to remember the ladies as they put together the American government. Of course, they ignore it. But I think it's important to realize that it doesn't really just begin at Seneca Falls. It begins way before. And I actually do try to trace a little bit of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some of the other foremothers and how they come to the movement. One of the interesting things I say before we get to Seneca Falls, and this will, I think, resonate with you and with the audience, is one of the sort of origin stories of Seneca Falls is that in 1840, so 8 years before, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott are at the big World Abolition Society meeting in London. And Stanton is there really as a spouse, because her husband is a suffrage organizer, Henry is. But Lucretia Mott is actually an elected delegate from her meeting house in Philadelphia. And so they go there and they're told, no, women will not be able to be seated. You're going to have to sit in the balcony behind a curtain. And they're just furious, and they have to go up there. And all I could think of as a Jewish woman was, oh my goodness, they're being sent up into the balcony behind a mechitza. And I just, I was just, and it was the same impulse. Women should not be heard. They were not allowed to speak. They were not given a seat with the men. And I thought, that's very interesting. But Seneca Falls, to me, the story of that is, first of all, how modern the discussion was, the Declaration of Sentiments that is presented. Those are very modern concerns. You read it today and you say, whoa, we're still talking about that. Equal pay for equal work. That's in the Declaration of Sentiments. But the thing that floored me was realizing that Frederick Douglass was in the audience, and not only in the audience, but he had been invited there by Elizabeth Stanton, but he got up and he defended Elizabeth Stanton's resolution number 9, which was a demand for the franchise, for the vote. And most of the other participants, who were activists themselves, many of them, said, you shouldn't do this, Elizabeth. It's too controversial. It's too kind of way out there. And it's Frederick Douglass who convinces the other reluctant participants to support resolution number 9. And I don't think we would even know about Seneca Falls if it wasn't for Frederick Douglass. And that was an amazing moment for me.
Yeah, what has always stuck out for me about Seneca Falls, and I agree with you 100%, that the origins, there are multiple origins to the women's rights movement, is that suffrage is actually, it's not unanimously passed. It is one of the resolutions. The one that really jumped out at me earlier in my career was that they demanded that women have access to the professions, including the ministry. And that's already there in 1848 to open medicine and law and the ministry to women. And of course, just think of how long that took, those kinds of things happened. So it's, I mean, this is really the launching of a women's rights movement. And suffrage is one part of it. What it also jumps out at me, not at Seneca Falls, but a couple of years later, is there's one Jewish woman, an immigrant, who comes over from Poland named Ernestine Potowski Rose, and she speaks at the second National Women's Rights Convention, because Seneca Falls was a local convention. She speaks in 1851 at this National Women's Rights Convention, and but she had come from Poland. She had fled. Her father was going to use the dowry that her mother left her, the money that her mother left her. He was going to use it for her dowry. She had fled an arranged marriage. She refused. She claimed she sued her father. Who knows if she really did. But she had stopped over in England on the way to America, learned English, and she lands in New York in 1836, and she starts fighting immediately for married women's property rights, which is a huge issue. I mean, the vote, of course, is incredibly important, but also we need to understand that if you got married, you controlled nothing, not even the clothes that were on your back. Your husband owned absolutely everything, all the property you brought into the marriage and any of your earnings while you were in the marriage. So I think it's really important to see suffrage as as one of the aims of the women's rights movement. And then, of course, it becomes the focal aim subsequently.
Right. It's seen as the turnkey. It's the tool that will allow women to achieve these other legal and societal changes if they have a voice, if policymakers have to answer to them too. And so, yeah, sometimes when I give a talk, I try to mention the things that a woman could not do at this time in the middle of the 19th century. And it shocks my audiences. So besides the property, which of course, people bring up to me all the time, it's not till the 1970s that women could get a credit card without having their husband or their father co-sign for them, 1970s. But a woman, of course, was denied entry to most universities and colleges at that time, and professional schools. Also, her children belonged to the husband. She had no custodial rights whatsoever. So if she left an abusive marriage, she left her children. And I think that's something that, really women can feel that you have to change that. She also couldn't testify in a court of law. So I hope Joseph, pardon me, Rose. I hope she sued in England because she could not do that in America. And she couldn't testify. She couldn't bring civil suit. She couldn't testify in the court of law. She couldn't serve on a jury. So there's lots of things that the suffragists narrow the sense of women's rights. Seneca Falls is a women's rights meeting, and the ones you're discussing are women's rights. And they sort of narrow it and say, we're going to be one issue. We're going to be the vote because that will help us get the others.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about what happens after the Civil War with the amendments, because this is really a pivotal moment in American history when when African American men get the vote and the women in the suffrage movement who have been fighting already by the end of the Civil War, it's already 20 years, and they expect that Frederick Douglass is going to support them and that they're going to get the vote, and then they're really disappointed and they enshrine in I think the 14th Amendment the word male into the Constitution.
Right.
And this it takes us into a different stage in the movement.
Yeah, that's a heartbreaking stage, but I think it is an example of several important themes. One of them is that yes, the women have been working for 20, 25, even more years in the abolition movement. They've been working for the union. They start the Women's Loyal Union League. They gather hundreds of thousands of petitions to push President Lincoln to introduce a 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. He was kind of reluctant to do that. It's women helping push this. And it's all with the kind of tacit understanding, but it's not tacit, they're told that once the end of the war, all the dispossessed classes of citizens will get the right to vote. So that's going to be Black men, Black women, white women. And what happens afterwards, as you say, is that the powers that be in Congress and in the political establishment do what they often do and do to this day, pit these two disenfranchised classes together against one another and say, oh, only one of you can come through. They actually say the nation can't handle two big reforms in once, too much for the brain. And so there's enormous violence in the Reconstruction period, and Black men are being lynched and killed. And Frederick Douglass is very unhappy about having to make this choice. To leave his colleagues in the women's suffrage movement behind, but says, we need this for our very lives. There's a famous speech where he says it's not because Black women need it, not because the women need the vote, but because they're Black. And so there's this terrible rift where the women are betrayed. They don't just feel betrayed, they are betrayed. But they react in a way that will bedevil the movement from then on, which is they react with very racist arguments, not only against Black men, but against immigrant men too. So these early suffragists, many of them, perhaps most of them, are native born. They're middle class, they're well educated, and they're horrified that men who had been slaves the day before are suddenly given the vote. Immigrant men can come to our shores, get the vote pretty quickly. They may not be able to read, but they can vote. And so they lash out against immigrant men and Black men, and it's almost class as much as race. And those vile statements are brought up today to show their racism. And it's true, it absolutely does, but you do have to put it in context of what the fight was right then. And it's a terrible moment. And, it is a time when Frederick Douglass says to the women, this is not the woman's hour. That's where the title of my book comes from. The woman's hour will have to wait. I promise you it will come. And he actually makes good on that promise. He works for universal suffrage, for women's suffrage, for the rest of his life, which is another 50 years. And he goes to almost every women's rights convention and speaks there and advocates for them. So he's truly a hero in my book for so many reasons. And one of them was even when he was attacked, he is firm in his belief that women should get the vote.
Right. Yeah, but you're right. As the movement, first of all, two national associations are founded, two national women's suffrage associations are founded. They have different views on what's going to be the best way. And I don't know that everybody knows that, suffrage was also fought state by state, and
Right.
states in the West began to enact suffrage laws, and Wyoming was the first. What's interesting is, although people don't remember this, is actually Wyoming was the first one to enact it in 1869, but in 1870 Utah enacted suffrage, and women in Utah voted. So Mormon women actually voted, and then they stripped them of that right. It was a battle over questions about polygamy, and then in Utah they get suffrage again, I think maybe 1896. But there's this divide. How do you go about this? What's the way? Do you go state by state, or do you go for the federal amendment? And these two organizations are really bitter because they don't know what's the best way to go about it. And then there's a moment where they do come back together, and there's also a turn to militancy. I mean, skipping a couple of decades, because it's the period of the doldrums in the movement, but there is this turn to militancy. Do you want to talk about that? You want to talk about Alice Paul a little bit?
Sure. We should also, just to go back to the Western states, I'm often asked, so why are the Western states? And the whole idea of why it can be state by state and also federal, it's our federalist system. It's the states are in our Constitution are given control of voting requirements and voting election administration. That's why we have problems today of differing qualification definitions and voter suppression coming out of the states. And it's all part of this fundamental how it's structured. So the states can give the vote, afford the vote to its women citizens. And so the Western states, and if you look at those early states, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, there aren't a whole lot of women there. And part of it, we have to acknowledge, is it was really a marketing ploy. Like, come move to Idaho, and there's big empty spaces here, and you can get the vote. So that's one of the reasons. There's also a kind of pioneer spirit that not bogged down by establishment rules as in the East. So you see, when you see a map of state sanctioned suffrage, you see it just creep up the West Coast. Finally, in 1911, California gets it. But it's a very slow slog. And there are, we should say, scores of referenda campaigns. And the suffragists go all out. They are campaigning in every town. There's several in New York, including two large ones in 1915. 1917 finally succeeds. New Jersey has one, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, all in 1915. Total bust. It's defeated with gusto. So you have to realize that they're working constantly on that while the federal amendment is stuck in Congress for 40 years. 40 years it's being ignored. The suffragists go up every year and testify, and it's thrown back in the file cabinet. And Elizabeth Stanton talks about, we've seen some hearings like this, where she's giving her very reasoned, legalistic reasons that women should have the right to vote. And she says in her memoirs that the committee chairman and the committee members would be eating their lunch, clipping their nails, reading the newspaper, doing anything but listening to her. And she said at one point she had to restrain herself from throwing her manuscript of testimony at their heads. She gets so frustrated. 40 years. So you have very slow progress in the states at the beginning of the 20th century, and very slow progress in Congress. And as happens in many movements, including the labor movement, including the later civil rights movement, including the gay rights movement, it happens a long-term, frustrating, slow-moving campaign for change. You're going to have differing ideas about what the best strategy is. And so Alice Paul, she's in her 20s, she's a graduate student in Great Britain. She comes upon the suffrage movement there, which has also taken a turn towards more confrontational tactics. There it really is militant. There they really do set bombs and set fires and smash windows. It's never violent in America. We should remember that. I never use the word militant. It's, you know, it's radical, but it's not militant. She comes home and says, you know, this movement hasn't gone anywhere. It's been sitting in place. It's treading water. And so she says, we're going to do it differently. And she breaks off from the mainstream group, as often happens, and starts her own. And that's the National Women's Party. And they engage in tactics that have never been used before, like picketing the White House, like demonstrating. Marches had been used for a long time, but it's the more confrontational, and civil disobedience. Women don't pay taxes. A lot of women, not just in the Women's Party, refuse to pay their taxes. No taxation without representation. They bring that banner back. So you have this split where the mainstream suffragists are appalled by the militant or radical tactics of Alice Paul and her Women's Party. And that's a split that continues to the end of the movement, and actually continues beyond the movement. So you have the younger, more radical wing of the movement confronting the sort of old guard. And, you know, when we've had similar confrontations lately in Congress with young congresswomen and older established women, and I keep saying it's the same dynamic. And historians, as you know, have debated whether this slowed down the movement, the fact that you had two rival movements, or did it actually propel the movement by the synergy? So do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I'm not, I mean, I think the major change, what enabled the ratification eventually, not the ratification, but Congress passing it eventually to go through, was what happened during World War I and the transition in World War I. But what really strikes me, and I think people don't really quite understand this, is what was seen as, if you prefer the word radical, although they use the word in America, they use the word militant, was the way, were the things that women were doing that were so, maybe they called it unladylike, so shocking. So to include Jewish women here, and I want to ask you about that in a minute, but there was one woman that I've written about recently named Sophia Lobinger, who was a founder of a suffrage organization that did things like climb a ladder in a crowd of men, wearing a banner saying suffragette and pleading with them for the votes, or going into a crowd shaking a tambourine with yellow streamers behind it, because that's the color of the movement, and then passing it and collecting money. I mean, this is a middle class woman, probably upper class woman. I mean, these are really shocking things. And then, of course, what you didn't mention is how Alice Paul and the women who are picketing the White House. I mentioned this to a friend recently. She said, well, of course you can picket the White House. What's the big deal? And no, they got arrested and they got thrown into jail and they got 7 months. I mean, Alice Paul got 7 months for picketing the White House. And then when they went on a hunger strike, they were force fed. You know, I think a lot of people thought the force feedings only happened in Great Britain, but they also happened in the United States. So I do think that they needed both arms of the movement. I think the militant group got the attention,
yes.
And even though, like Carrie Chapman Catt, who's the head of it, of the non-militant group by this point, is so concerned about how what they're doing is actually going to derail the process. But I think it needed both streams. But you're right, the militant group gave it. It probably spurred the anti-suffragists.
Yeah,
much
and when you think of it, we're going through that right now. There's peaceful protests, and there are those who are saying we need to be even more confrontational in different ways. Similar dynamic. But yeah, when the women are sent to prison and are force-fed and are manacled to the jail cells and are not allowed to speak, they have to communicate by singing. And they are attacked. There's the Night of Terror when they are assaulted physically assaulted and terrorized. And you see these incredible photographs in the Library of Congress of some of the women coming out, being released, and they're so weak from the hunger strike that they literally cannot walk. And they, President Wilson authorized a psychiatrist to visit Alice Paul and threaten her with being committed to an insane asylum. It was all to break her leadership. Of course, they couldn't find anything wrong. So, yeah, it was a moment. I talk about the prison special, which is basically this amazing public relations ploy after the women are released, after World War I. After World War I's over. And they travel the country in a Pullman railroad car, giving speeches in every city, in recreations of their prison garb, made by a seamstress, and say, we are your mothers, we are your sisters and your daughters, and we have been imprisoned and tortured for asking for the vote. And that really begins to put pressure in a whole different way. So I totally agree with you that I think they needed both sides to propel. And I should say, Alice Paul didn't just demonstrate. She was lobbying. She had a crackerjack lobbying organization. And she's, they're doing all the political things that were necessary also. You can't just demonstrate. You also have to have a political strategy, and she did have that.
Right, and of course the other piece of it, why World War I is so important, is, so back to Sophia Lobinger, during World War I, she's made a captain in the New York Women's Police Division. So she was a real character.
Oh, wow.
And she was also a proud Jewish woman. So I think one of the things that has gotten lost, which I think is relevant for this conversation, is that we hear a lot about the distinctiveness of and what African-American women faced in the suffrage movement, the racism that they faced, both from the suffragists and from the antis. I mean, it was really both sides, because they threatened the suffragists, who were worried that they would derail getting this through, but the antis also didn't want them to vote and was afraid that it would affect their success in Jim Crow. So it's really, they were facing it from both sides. But Jewish women tend to be absent in all the histories and the commemorations that have happened recently. I mean, there were 3 exhibits in Washington, D.C., and Jewish women are absent in all of them. I think Rose Schneiderman might appear in one. She was a labor activist. She was very active for suffrage, by the way. She thought she wanted it, but she didn't think it was going to make any difference. She assumed that it wouldn't affect, women wouldn't clean up government, which is what they had hoped. But I've been curious about your take on that, because in your book, when you identify Maud Nathan, who is was a relative of Emma Lazarus, a part of this very important New York Jewish family, was really the best known, I think, of the Jewish women suffragists. Anita Pulitzer, you write about, was the best known of the activist suffragists coming out of the Women's Party. But you didn't mention that Maud Nathan and her sister Annie Nathan Mayer, who was opposed to women's suffrage, you didn't mention that they were Jewish. I was curious why.
Well, I was actually a little surprised when you mentioned that, because I thought I had. I distinctly remember writing about, that they were from a very distinguished Sephardic Jewish family. That may have been edited out. Like, I had this memory that I wrote it because it is important, but I'm sorry it's not there, if that's what happened. Those 2 sisters are so fascinating, because of course Annie is the founder of Barnard College, and Barnard women play a huge role not only in suffrage movement, but then later in women's rights. And she believes in education, but she does not believe in the potency of the vote or the necessity of the vote. And there's this literal sibling rivalry, because her sister Maud is a very distinguished suffrage leader. And, I've read all kinds of accounts, and there's a little bit of psychology put on it, that this wasn't just a political argument, but it's, the fact that you could have those kind of disagreements within a family is really important for us to realize that this wasn't just a political question. It was also a debate about a societal question, a cultural question, for some a moral question of what is women's role in society. What are her rights and what is her role? Now, we're still debating that. But it was a much more complicated thing than just getting the vote. And that's why you see families torn apart about this.
So I'm going to move forward a little bit. The House passes the suffrage amendment in May of 1919. The Senate passes it on June 4th of 1919, and it's sent out to the states. And it comes down to Tennessee, which, as you said, is really the story that you're telling and how you go back. So talk about what happens in August 1920 and why it's down to Tennessee. What's happened?
Yeah, so the process for having an amendment to the Constitution is that it has to be passed by both houses of Congress by a 2/3 majority. That takes 40 years. And it also passes very narrowly. I think in both houses, it's like 2 or 3 votes. So this is, the idea of consensus is not there. But it does pass finally in June of 1919, goes out to the states, and then it has to be ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the states. So there's 48 states in the Union, then 36 have to ratify for it to enter the Constitution. By the summer of 1920, 35 have ratified. And they only need 13 to reject it, and it'll be dead. And 9 have rejected it. And there are several more in the pipeline, most of these in the South, but not completely. Maryland, we both live in Maryland. Maryland not only rejects the 19th Amendment, and will not fully ratify it, even ceremonially, till 1958. But it also, Delaware rejects the amendment. And here we have to understand there are other forces. There are, in Maryland's case, racist forces. They don't want Black women to be able to vote. In Delaware, there are also economic forces because there are a lot of corporations that don't want women to vote, because it's going to upset the status quo. So it turns out, for a variety of reasons, that Tennessee is the kind of last best hope. It's the only viable state. There are 2 northern states that the suffragists thought they would ratify quickly, which is Vermont and Connecticut. The governors there are under corporate pressure from their donors, and they refuse to call a special session of the legislature to come back and ratify. And so Tennessee turns out to be the last best hope. And it's a terrible place to have to put all the fortunes of the suffrage movement, because it's a southern state. The governor doesn't want to, he's up for re-election. He doesn't want to have it here. The legislature doesn't want it. And the plucky suffragists, who are also kind of infighting in Tennessee, they say, we can do it, we can do it. Even the suffrage leaders are not so sure, but they have no choice. And it comes down to Tennessee, and it's just a wild fight, because you have all the themes, all the arguments. Women are not stable enough, they're too emotional, they will be sullied by touching politics. The American home will be affected because women will abandon their families. All of these arguments that have been used since, for women going to work, women running for office, will be used there. And then the racial element will be very, very strong, because the 19th Amendment does accord the vote to all women citizens, 21 years and older. And that will include Black women. And so the southern states can't abide by that. And they will fight. And so we see that fight take place in Tennessee. But I wanted to ask you, Pam, what do you think Jewish women had a special feeling for or sense of commitment to the suffrage movement? Why do you think
I do, well, certainly by the 19 teens, Jewish women in America overwhelmingly embraced suffrage. There's no question. And what's different, I think, about the Jewish story is the way they argue about it. So when Maud Nathan, for example, sends out a letter to community rabbis, she's appealing to, you know, how can a people that was oppressed continue to oppress other people? So I think there's something very different about the way that they make the argument. And then you mentioned the suffrage campaigns in 1915 and 1917 in New York. And of course, that's where, at that point in time, about half of America's Jews are living in New York City. And we know that in 1917, when the returns came in, the districts that were very heavy Jewish immigrant districts were overwhelmingly in favor of suffrage. I mean, it was really striking. Now, it took a lot of effort on the part of immigrant women in those districts to get, you know, they corralled people at settlement houses, they stood outside soapboxes, outside of factories, they got pelted with tomatoes, they got told, go home and wash the dishes. But in the end, what happened in New York in 1917 was that the major Yiddish newspaper, The Forward, the Workmen's Circle, which was a very large Jewish organization, a labor organization, and also the New York Socialist Party, and there were many socialists in the Lower East Side, they all came out in favor of women's suffrage. And again, the argument was, how could Jews not vote for this, given the oppression that they've known? So I do think there is something distinctive about the Jewish story. But it's very clear that women like Maud Nathan kind of got, you know, melded into the larger story, because as white American women, they weren't, you know, particularly distinctive.
We should also just clarify that in the vote in the Jewish neighborhoods, only men could vote in these referendum. It's women had no actual say. They could campaign, but they couldn't vote.
Yeah.
Thank you both. This conversation has been absolutely fascinating, and I think I've gotten comments back. People really have enjoyed what you have said, and I know the two of you could go on and teach us more for a very long time. We'll have to maybe have you back another time. But before we take some questions, and we have quite a few questions from people, we just wanted to ask some questions, bringing it more to current times, the Equal Rights Amendment. Why do you suppose that the 19th Amendment passed, but the ERA never did?
Right. So I hope we're going to have time. I want to ask Elaine one question about how close it was that the 19th Amendment passed and almost didn't pass. But I'll answer your question, and then maybe I can ask Elaine that question. Sure. What happens with the 19th Amendment, what happens with the Equal Rights Amendment is very controversial from the get-go. It comes out of the Women's Party, it comes out of the militant wing or the radical wing, comes out of Alice Paul, and what we should remember is the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced into every single session of Congress from 1923 until 1972, when it goes out for ratification to the states. There's a lot of opposition from progressive women, from organizations like the National Council of Jewish Women. There's a lot of opposition because there has been, in 1921, the Shepard-Towner Act protects infant women and children, infants and children and their mothers. It protects them. It establishes what we call protective legislation. And the federal government, for the first time ever, gives the states money to have prenatal clinics, to have infant welfare clinics, to educate women, and it's meant to help reduce infant mortality. There's a fear on the part of progressive men and women that if an Equal Rights Amendment comes into play, all of this protective legislation will go out the window. Women won't be protected, children won't be protected any longer. And so that's the reason for the very long history of the opposition.
Yeah, and I should say that also labor, a lot of Jewish women and men are involved in the labor movement, and labor was opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment because it would also possibly negate many of the protective legislations for women in industry. that had been very, took a long time to get through, like, pregnant women didn't have to lift certain weights when they were working in factories. This was to protect women, and they feared that an equal rights amendment, which was to level the playing field legally, might jeopardize those. So you're very right. It comes out of the radical wing of the suffragists. The mainstream suffragists never support it. Carrie Catt never supports it. Eleanor Roosevelt never supports the ERA. So I think, we look at the ERA today as a sort of litmus test of your feminist bona fides. And I think it has changed meaning in the interim, but we should remember it was very controversial. It was not embraced by all progressive women at all.
And so is it still needed today? I mean, just in January, Virginia became the 38th state to ratify it, though the passage of time doesn't make it official. But is it still needed? And what movements are out there to move it along?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that I think it's the 27th Amendment, the previous amendment, which is about the Congress cannot legislate changes in their salaries unless, and it won't become effective until the next session of Congress. That amendment was proposed to the first Congress. It took 202 years. So that's the first thing. We should kind of put this first 7 years and then 10-year limit on the ERA. We should kind of put that in some kind of broader context. The United States is, I think, the only major Western industrial power that does not have enshrined in law equality of the sexes. And it's a pretty basic, text. It's that equality of the sexes. So, I mean, I think that it's desperately needed. I think that rather than women's rights have been won bit by bit, as Elaine was talking earlier. It was, in 1974, married women could get credit cards in their own name without needing their husbands to get a credit card. I bet most people who saw Mrs. America had no idea that when Kate Blanchett or the Phyllis Schlafly character is asking her husband to sign a credit card slip, to give her the card, that's what's going on in that scene. So but it's really going to be, right now it's between Congress and the courts. Yeah. Congress, the House has voted to repeal the time limit. The Senate hasn't done anything. And I'm sure it's already in the courts as well. Who's going to end up deciding? And then there were states that rescinded it.
Yeah.
And
Tennessee was one of them.
Yes,
yeah.
Well, I should tell you, Tennessee also rescinded the 19th Amendment.
Right. Can you tell us the story about Harry Burns?
Yeah. So, the story of what happens in Tennessee is dramatic in itself, but then it has this kicker, which, I don't write fiction, but I couldn't have even made up anything like this. It comes down that the suffragists their support has melted away in the face of bribery and pressure and all kinds of threats made up to the legislators. They're held in line by a Jewish legislator from Memphis named Joe Hanover, comes from Poland with his family when he's 5 years old, believes in the American dream. It becomes the floor leader for the suffragists in the House in Tennessee. But it comes down to a tie vote. It's going to be a tie. There's another legislator who is pressured into voting for ratification. We won't go into how that happens. But then it comes down that there's the youngest legislator in the whole General Assembly, 24 years old, freshman delegate from a tiny hill town in East Tennessee, Nyota. I've been to his house. And he personally believes in suffrage. His mother is a suffragist, one of the few in town, but his constituency is not. He's up for re-election. He wants to have a political career. And he knows he wants a duck. He just wants a duck. He doesn't want to have, he just wants to go with the flow. and vote against it if that's the way it's going, and all will be fine. What he finds is that he could break the tie. And in his pocket that morning, he had received a letter from his mother. And you can actually see this letter online. And it's a beautiful letter, handwritten in pencil. And it's a mom letter. It's a letter that says, you know, Uncle Harry has a cold and my bursitis is kicking up. And there's even a shopping list asking him to buy certain things for her in the big city. But then she says, be a good boy and vote for suffrage. Hurrah for suffrage. And he has this letter in his breast pocket when the vote comes, the roll call comes to him, and he changes his vote and he votes to ratify. And it's one of those moments where he actually, it's a vote of conscience rather than a politically motivated vote. He is vilified. He's accused of taking bribes. There are indignation meetings with torches in his district. It gets ugly, but he's actually reelected.
Yeah.
Wow.
What's so amazing is in that story is you see how the words of every single woman who had fought for suffrage come down to his mother, and that every woman who was involved in this movement played a role ultimately in getting it through. So it's just, it's amazing, but you're right. I mean, it reads like fiction.
Let's get to some of the questions here. Jane would like to know, what was the role of the National Jewish Council for Women in Hadassah during suffrage?
So this is very interesting. The National Council of Jewish Women, of course, founded in 1893, was, as the historian who's really written about this, Melissa Clapper, tells in Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, her book, was crawling with suffragists. But the National Council of Jewish Women never endorses suffrage. And it doesn't because maybe it's concerned about anti-Semitism, but there's also the reality that it's concerned about alienating some of its members. And Annie Nathan Mayer, who we talked about before, the founder of Barnard College, you know, is a member of the National Council of Jewish Women, and she's opposed. And so the idea is you'll end up splitting the organization. It's not that old. And Jewish women's organizations are just getting off the ground. The powerhouse organizations that we think of today are just getting off the ground. Hadassah doesn't create a resolution for suffrage. It does send in 1918 a telegram to Wilson applauding that he has churned and become to endorse suffrage. What's interesting about Hadassah is that, and this is something that, you know, we should remember, is that after the suffrage amendment passes, it has all sorts of ramifications beyond just in terms of the ERA. So there's a fight in the Jewish community in British Mandate Palestine, and then Hadassah gets behind that fight to give women the vote. They're actually writing a constituent assembly.
Similar to that, Elaine, you were talking when we spoke the other day, excuse me, about, I think you called it the Battle of the Bemas between Rabbi Stephen S. Weiss and Rabbi Joseph Silverman. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was fascinating. I came across this. Rabbi Stephen Weiss was a real social activist in many causes. And he was a champion of women's suffrage. He even cut for the 1917 New York referendum. He spoke in Carnegie Hall. He cut a record, an RCA Victrola record, which you can actually hear online. You got to hear his voice. You know, if this is the way rabbis were supposed to speak, it's quite something. But he's a firm proponent, and he bases it on Jewish principles of justice. He really uses Jewish principles to describe, you know, I actually have a quote here, you know, that I believe in equal suffrage because I believe in the fundamental rightness of democracy. Suffrage is a duty and an obligation of a woman as truly as a man. Think of that with halakha decisions, and it's very interesting. And so he has a profound disagreement with his Reform rabbinical colleague, Rabbi Joseph Silverman of Temple Emmanuel in New York. And they really go at it from the bema and in the letter to editor columns of the New York papers, and at podiums, at public talks about that. And Silverman says, a woman is not fitted for a soldier or a statesman, has no place on the battlefield or at the ballot box. Her place is where the spirit of love alone holds sway. And it got really ugly. And in 1917, actually, Rabbi Weiss convinces the Central Conference of American Rabbis to endorse suffrage. And they say something really interesting in their resolution. We recognize the justice of a thoroughgoing democracy. In a country which upholds democratic ideas and principles, it is unethical and unjust to shut out women from active participation. The Jewish people have reason to know the hardship and bitterness of unjust and prescriptive political discrimination. So I find that really interesting.
Can I add another story about Weiss?
Please.
Because in 1919, so he's the rabbi at what's called the Free Synagogue in New York, and in the school newspaper, a 15-year-old named Louise later Louise E Neuman, writes a letter and saying, in this moment of tremendous change, isn't it time that women became rabbis? And he writes back to her in 1919 and says, just because a woman's never been a rabbi doesn't mean it can't happen. And he encourages her to consider studying for the rabbinate. Of course, she married a rabbi instead of becoming a rabbi. But we see, again, the kind of repercussions of this, of what having the vote means. What else is going to change?
Yep. And that's what the anti-suffragists are worried about in general.
Right.
So I hate to end it, but we have to. We've come to our end of the hour. Thank you both. This was just delightful to talk to both of you. I just wanted to remind everybody that Pamela's book is America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today. And Elaine's book is The Women's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote. And you can purchase both of those books through bookshop.org, which will take you to local bookstores. And thank you. Please join us next week. As I mentioned, it's The March Continues, the message of civil rights pioneers Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and what it means for our times. We have Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's daughter, Susanna Heschel, will be joining us, along with children's book author Rich Michelson, who wrote a book about the two of them. If you have enjoyed our program today, we ask that you please consider going to momentmag.com and providing a donation so that we can continue this great programming. Again, Elaine, Pamela, thank you so much. I hope that we can do this again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Great pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.